Yeah.
Just a quick introduction before I start my speech. This is an old speech that I have rescued for today's session, but hopefully it won't be outdated in any way. You have some vocab in the chat and also in the Excel sheet that we shared. I'm kind of side translating from a Spanish script, so I hope it will be fluent enough. And if you're ready, I will begin now. But Teresa, your mic is on. If you can please switch it off. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the topic of my speech, as you may have seen, is emergency architecture. I don't know if this happens to you, but when I write a speech about something that I'm interested in, obviously the topic stays close to my heart, and I'm always excited to see it pop up in the news or in some book that I'm reading. And this is what has happened this week. I wrote this speech about emergency architecture a few years back. And this year, because we are, you will agree, in an emergency scenario, it has been the subject of some articles in the press. So I thought it was a good time to go back to it. But let's go back to the basics. Architecture in itself, what is it? Well, it's definitely an art. It's a form of expression. It's a way of displaying power, of being ostentatious of one's wealth, of leaving a mark on the surface of the planet Earth that will be there once we're all dead and buried. However, in the developed world, we often forget that the actual main aim of architecture is that of creating structures that are useful and that fulfill a function and address the needs of people, especially the need for shelter. This basic concept becomes increasingly clear in crisis scenarios, be them wars, natural disasters such as floods, wildfires, or earthquakes. In such situations, and often overnight, the pre-existing structures disappear and people are left just with the clothes on their back and homeless. And this is where emergency architecture comes into action. Before I move on to give you some examples of emergency architecture, I would like to define it. What it is, how it works, what materials it uses, and which are its aims. So, when? ASAP, as soon as possible after a disaster. We need emergency architecture to build structures that can be put up really quickly after an emergency to provide shelter for the people who have lost their homes. Such structures must be easy to assemble so they can be built by the community itself. This is not only so that structures can be built even faster, but also because when people cooperate in the reconstruction efforts, they feel dignified, and it can be a good skill building exercise. As you can see, this is radically different from some architectural projects that we're used to. In this case, it's not a top-down approach where a superstar architect creates a wonderful design that's then built by a team of builders on site, but rather it's built through a more cooperative process. And this kind of cooperative philosophy has made emergency architecture very popular among self-sufficient movements and new social trends against the capitalist system. Moving on to the materials. The materials for emergency architecture must be easy to source and also cheap. Obviously, in an emergency situation, nobody has the time or the money to go around looking for mahogany wood or marble or such materials. The materials for emergency architecture must also be easy to manipulate, resistant, and if possible, sustainable. For example, recycled materials would be very good. This is done in order to minimize waste once those emergency structures can be dismantled and more long-lasting buildings can be built. As for the aims of emergency architecture, well, we anticipated them at the beginning of the speech. It's about addressing the needs of a community that has been hit by an emergency. So it's not only about providing shelter in the form of housing and sanitation, such as toilets or medical facilities, but also in providing dignity and privacy. Which are essential factors for the socio-economic recovery of an area. I'm sure that if you had the time to think in the middle of your note-taking, you would be imagining one of those massive sports center where people are housed temporarily after being evacuated from, for example, an area that has been hit by a flood. In those sports centers, there's no privacy. We only have camping beds that are just 1 or 2 meters apart from each other. The ceilings are extremely high. It's the opposite of cozy and private, and it damages our human worth and dignity. Many organizations around the world are devoted to emergency architecture. For example, Architects Without Borders, the Open Architecture Network, and Architecture for Humanity. However, emergency architecture is not only the job of NGOs and non-for-profit organizations. There are also world-renowned architects, architects with Pritzker prizes and who sign multi-million-dollar projects, who also design emergency structures. On the one hand, it's their way of giving something back to a society that has been good to them, but it's also a way of putting their skill to the test, of testing their ingenuity when they have to work without the multi-million-dollar budgets that they're used to. And on top of that, it's an opportunity for them to experiment with new techniques, new materials that they wouldn't have the chance to use in their more expensive projects. One such architect is Shigeru Ban, a Japanese architect. He designed emergency structures in the aftermath of the Kobe and Nepal earthquakes, and also for the refugees fleeing genocide in Rwanda in the 90s. The basis of his emergency architecture projects are cardboard tubes. Recycled cardboard tubes, which he uses to build all sorts of structures, mainly housing, of course, houses and other kinds of shelter, but also more specific buildings according to the needs of each community. For example, after the earthquakes in Kobe, Japan, and Christchurch, New Zealand, he built churches out of cardboard tubes because a church was an important element of the local community. In the Italian town of L'Aquila, which was destroyed by an earthquake a few years back, I don't know if you'll remember, the reconstruction efforts were undermined by corruption and bureaucracy. But in spite of that, Shigeru Ban managed to build a music hall for the students of the local music conservatory. That's all from me, but I just want to finish the speech by saying, by reminding you, by reminding myself how I came across emergency architecture this week again. As you know, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are building makeshift hospitals, often in the sports centers that I mentioned earlier on. In this case, it's not only about providing privacy for the patients and their families who are going through very hard moments in this context, but also to prevent contagion. It's definitely quite dangerous to have many patients in a single sports center without any separation between them. And this is where structures such as the temporary shelter built out of cardboard tubes and other such projects can be very handy. So to finish my speech, I just invite you to read a little about this, look at the pictures, which I of course could not include in a consecutive speech, because I'm sure you will be very impressed. Thank you.